I'm here today to present a small segment of my dissertation research, which I conducted in both Guatemala and the United States from 2015 to 2018, and to bear witness to the experiences of young people who generously shared their stories and perspectives with me. If migration is a story, the part that we usually hear about is the journey northwards and reception in the United States. I'm not here to tell that part of the story. I'm here to talk about where the story starts, about communities from which migration occurs. This presentation focuses on young people who, as a result of living in communities of extreme migration, aspire for non-migratory futures. They're striving to create lives at home. And in so doing, I argue that these youth reconstruct narratives of the value of migration and what it means to be free. But what is freedom? Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. So ends the sonnet by American poet Emma Lazarus, inscribed in the Statue of Liberty. This message is that freedom is the apparent result of having arrived in the United States. This notion of freedom is embedded in the Declaration of Independence and conceptualizations of the American dream, despite the fact that this country has been built on the denial of freedom to many. And freedom continues to be an iconic part of how the American story is narrated. Why do I begin this talk inherently about the lives and livelihoods of youth 1,300 miles south of the border? Because narratives of freedom, as inaccurate as they may be in practice, powerfully shape public policy, decision-making, and the pathways of possibility imagined by people on both sides of the border. Inaccurate narratives can have very real effects. During the summer of 2014 and in the years following, record numbers of unaccompanied and undocumented youth, principally from Central America, have been apprehended at the US southern border. Why do they come? Poverty, insecurity, and lack of opportunities in their countries of origin have been identified as primary push factors by researchers and politicians. Notions of freedom and the American dream are mobilized across the ideological spectrum. Immigration advocates analogizing the right to migrate with the right to freedom and a better future. Conversely, those who perceive immigration and immigrants as fundamental social threats tend to construe freedom in the American dream as a zero-sum game, a limited resource for which immigrants will be competing against American citizens. The concept of the American dream is not only mobilized on this side of the border. While conducting initial research in 2015 with NGO workers in Guatemala, I was told over and over again that young people were migrating in search of el sueño americano. This was said to me in part to illustrate the belief that young people didn't understand the real risks of migration, that they were somehow migrating out of ignorance, seeking an imaginary better life. When I later returned to Guatemala to examine the context for young people living in communities of extreme migration, communities where upwards of 60% of people have either migrated or attempted migration, it was to ask, how does living in these communities impact the ways in which youth plan for their own futures? In Guatemala, communities of extreme migration tend to be rural and indigenous. They're ignored by the federal government with limited access to basic services like running water, electricity, education, employment opportunities. Researchers of migration have proposed in communities with enduring histories of migration that a culture of migration develops. And according to this theory, youth in these communities are conditioned towards migration as the dominant pathway to build a future. Given the narratives around el sueño americano that I encountered in 2015, it might be expected that my research would replicate these patterns. Youth living in contexts of migration, espousing the virtue of the American dream, and their future plans to migrate northwards. And while it is true that some of the more than 50 young people who generously enough let me into their lives did talk about wanting to migrate and achieve the American dream, most did not. What I found instead was that living within a culture of migration had, for these youth, caused them to call into question the definition of freedom, particularly in migratory contexts, and critically reconsider the negative impacts migration had had on their communities. I argue that not only did living within a culture of migration produce a will to stay, but that youth rearticulated conceptions of freedom and what it means to live a good life as an act of resistance and self-determination. While money from remittances has built massive houses out of cinder blocks, brought electricity and paved roads, as you can see in this image, the toll of these material gains, both for those who remain and those who have left, have been immense. For these young people, migration resulted in a breakdown of their culture, generations who have grown up without close family members, and new cycles of predatory debt as the costs of getting across the border rise even higher. They articulated these experiences in explaining why they were striving to stay. Anna, whose father first migrated in the late 1990s, explained that witnessing his pain as he described his life as a migrant has informed her will to remain in the community. She told me that despite not being able to find work, living in precarity and everyday racism as an Indigenous woman, she still believed she was freer in Guatemala than she ever would be in the United States, where her people suffer even more exploitation, are forcibly disconnected from their culture, language, and daily life. Ingrid, whose older brother migrated 10 years ago, told me that people in the US are not free. Instead, her brother explained, you migrate to humiliate yourself, not to create a life. She is striving to avoid a migratory future, working multiple low-paying jobs and recently completing a degree in education, but she knows that despite her striving, she may ultimately be forced to join her brother in the United States to help support her family economically, but it will not be in pursuit of her American dream. Josue lives in fear of not being able to feed his 2-year-old daughter. But he grew up without his parents because they had both migrated when he was young, and he does not want his daughter to have the same fate. He too describes his will to stay as a fight for freedom, a version of freedom not predicated on economic wealth, but on the ability to walk through his community without fear and to be able to continue learning. It is noteworthy how often young people I worked with brought up freedom in reference to migration to the United States. This is not an articulation of el sueño americano. It is an expression of something altogether different. A freedom found not in the earning potential north of the border, but in the act of surviving at home. For these youth, migration is described as a form of systematic dispossession of Indigenous peoples, one propagated by policies of the Guatemalan government, unfair trade agreements, and the insatiable demand for low-wage labor north of the border. Migration is not liberation. In this context, I argue that reimagining freedom as something outside of financial success and within the bounds of physical, cultural, and linguistic liberty to push back against the dominant narratives of the American dream is an explicitly anti-colonial act on the part of Indigenous youth living in contexts where migration has shaped every aspect of their lives. So here are some of their words. Thank you.